Welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. The book was written in 1970 and is currently out of print. We are on chapter 13. Saul went to his bedroom as a refuge, a tomb, the sharp lines of the rain at the window reflecting themselves on the pale gleaming walls, and the air was alive with thunderous sound. It was cold in the cubiculum and draughty, and Saul shivered and looked about him vaguely. He went to the window and stared out. He saw the yellow stone of the courtyard below his window, wet and running with water and vaguely polished. The turtle doves, which were bustling upon it, and he could hear the dolorous dripping and splashing of the rain. Upon the courtyard was a clump of dark cypresses bending in the wind. Beyond them a wall of the same yellow stone of the courtyard, on which fluttered the last tattered purple flowers of the dead summer. The dull gray sky boiled and rushed as if pursued, or as if caught in a whirlpool. Desolation overcame Saul. His mind remained empty of thoughts, for his emotions were too dolorous and anguished. His shivering became stronger. He sat on the bed and pulled a fur rug about his shoulders, and his red head bent until his chin touched his chest. A powerful longing for death shook him. It seemed to him that he did not possess organs within the flesh of his body any longer. He was one stony and churning pain, too deep for tears or sound. He did not know the full reason for his suffering. Then he was asleep on the bed. And evening came, and the window turned black, and the bedroom sank into deep shadow, and it was night. He began to dream. He was once again on the yellow rubble, and the sand and the dust of the fearful spot beyond the Damascus gate. And he was there to mourn and weep, but only one cross stood there, and it was taller and whiter than the others he had seen, and it loomed against a murky sky, as red as blood and trembling with flame. There were men there, Roman soldiers, and the sound of lamenting, but Saul did not heed them. His whole attention was fixed on the man who hung on the cross, with the dull blood streaming from his hands and feet. The light, though crimson, was not strong enough to see all details, but it came to Saul that the man's brow was bleeding also in many small places, yet Saul could not see what was causing this phenomenon. Then Saul perceived that the man was on this gigantic cross was unknown to poor workmen or peasant from the provinces who had looked at him with such intense penetration. Let me read that again. Then Saul perceived that the man on this gigantic cross was the unknown poor workman or peasant from the provinces who had looked at him with such intense penetration in the marketplace, and who had walked among the dying victims in this very spot, comforting them only a few hours before. An awesome silence lay on this desolate place, which was and yet was not the familiar place of execution. There was no sound of chanting, no voice of lifted in consolation and hope and promise, no comforter. The Roman soldiers were like a graven mass of dark stone huddled together. They did not move. And it was as if they were amorphous statues, dwindled and attenuated against that doomful bloody sky. But the cross and the crucified appeared to fill all the heavens, to rise from the four corners of the earth, human yet enormous, portentous and majestic yet appalling. It came to Saul that something of direful portent had been done in this place, and yet something greatly holy, and that earth had moved from her place and had been lifted up. Saul could not stir an arm or move a leg. He could not turn away his gaze from the man on the cross. It was as if he had been turned to iron. He was only sight and hearing, and not flesh. The crucified had large limbs as white as moonlight, on which the red shadow of the sky shook, moved in ripples. His golden beard and hair were dappled with blood. He appeared to sweat blood, and there was a wound in his side, and that too bled slowly and steadily. But his face was calm and most beautiful and reflective, as if he were alone in some ineffable peace beyond the understanding of men. His ribs arched against his pale skin, and he sagged upon his cross, yet he uttered no word at all. Saul thought that his heart, encased in the paralyzed metal that had replaced his flesh, would burst with grief and terror, and that he did not know why, for this man was a stranger, no more important or valuable or tortured than those who had died before him in this place. Saul asked in himself, "Why has he been executed?" And there was no answer. It was then that the man lifted his fallen head and looked fully at Saul, who seemed not to be standing on the earth, but some little distance above it, so that his and the man's face were level with each other's, yet at a considerable pace. The man's face was illuminated, but the light seemed to come from within, and not from the calamitous sky. Its radiance increased, and the blue eyes enlarged, so that at last Saul saw nothing but those eyes and the immense depths of them, as if they had looked beyond endless ages, and would look on endless more, and had known eternity. There was a great sound, as if the sky had cracked, and the cross and the man were enfolded, as it were, in a shell, and the carapace of a tremendous seed, and the ground opened, and the cross and the crucified descended into the black tomb, to the very last, until the earth closed over them. The eyes looked upon Saul in recognition and in love. Then there was nothing but that place, and even the soldiers had vanished, and the dim lamentation had ceased. The bloody light of the sky had faded. A soft gray darkness lay over all things. Suddenly birds were singing, and in the east the sky turned aureate, and the streamers of scarlet raced toward the zenith, and there was a rustling like a mighty wind on the earth. Saul saw, with incredulity, the boundless sprouts of green grain were rising from the earth, rushing to fulfillment, to fruition, as the world became light with new dawn. From moment to moment the grain sprang exuberantly from the ground, whispering, murmuring, ripening, until a vast horizonless plain spread before Saul, covered with wheat, and it rippled like a glittering gilded sea under the sun, and the scent of it was rich and swooning. Saul at once lost his grief and despair, and he looked at the infinitude of grain and exultation and rejoicing, as if from death and sorrow life had been resurrected to feed all men from the giant seed which had fallen into the earth and had been buried within it. He heard a tumult of voices, and young men appeared, bare of foot and humble of station, with their robes lifted about their darkened legs and hymns pushed into their robe girdles. Their heads were covered with coarse cloth which protected their necks, but their beards blew in the warm and shining wind. They carried scythes in their hands. They stood below Saul and contemplated the sea of grain. And then Saul saw that they were few in number, and their bodies and their arms and scythes were puny before the vastness awaiting them. Saul was seized with passion and impatience. He called out to the men, "Give me a scythe also, that I may cut the grain with you before it is night and winter is on the land." But the men did not turn their heads nor appear to hear him. They conferred together. They looked at the grain swollen with life and promise. And they were only little men, and this was a task for giants. And then Saul heard that powerful, familiar voice he had heard before. "The harvest is great, but the laborers are few." Saul, in a frenzy and a fever of impatience, desire, cried out again, "Give me a scythe also." The men had heard him, and they turned and looked at him with troubled expressions, and he saw their dark and distressful eyes. And then one came to him and reached up and put a scythe in his hand, and then suddenly smiled upon him and said, "Come." But he could not move. He struggled in the iron which was his flesh, and could not stir a single finger. He cried out over and over, his spirit in torment, and the iron burned him as the sun rose higher and heated it, and he felt his sweat like a torrent flowing internally, and his blood seemed to bubble and boil in his paralyzed veins. Suddenly a darkness like death itself fell over him, and he dropped down into a lightless abyss where it was colder than snow, and he saw the looming of spectral ice mountains about him as he sank deeper, and the glint of an unearthly moon on the frozen pinnacles that fled upwards from his descent. He heard the winds of eternity beating against his ears, and the bitterness of frost against his lips. "You ask the impossible, Hillel ben Baruch," said Shabua to his son-in-law in a reasonable voice. "We cannot delay the wedding. The doctors have assured us that my grandson will survive and that he will recover consciousness soon, though he has lain in his fevered swoon for 3 days and 3 nights. He has no disease. He has an affliction of the brain, mysterious but not contagious. He has excellent nurses who leave him not for an instant, and though he does not open his eyes, he drinks wine with water and spiced potions and medicines. He will live. It is an evil thing, say the superstitious." And here Shabua smiled. "To delay a wedding. I am not superstitious, but my many guests, including the illustrious Rabban Gamaliel, who has been here with you and Saul daily, have been invited, and it would be beyond forgiveness if I were to send messages to them that the wedding was not to take place." "Sephora is his sister, and he loves her," said Hillel. Shabua smiled again superbly. "Hillel, he would not have the wedding delayed because of his illness. He would be mortified, embarrassed that he had caused inconvenience and disarray." Hillel, considering his son's temperament, was forced to agree. He left Shabua and returned to Saul's chamber, where a brazier burned against the autumn chill, and the woolen curtains were drawn where Saul lay under thick fur rugs in his baffling and unwaking swoon. Hillel had slept in a chair near him for 3 nights, since the night Saul had been discovered fainting on his bed. The doctors had come and gone, day and night, frowning and puzzling over the symptoms, discussing the intense fever, the fulminating sweating, the tremblings, the quiverings, the shakings, the strange discordant cries of the stricken patient. The head of the Roman health department had appeared with his best physicians, for all sudden diseases had to be reported, for fear of the plague endemic among the accursed Parthians beyond the frontiers of Israel and Syria. The Parthians were many and turbulent, and an affliction to the Romans, who knew the Parthians had sworn to overthrow them and drive them from the east. And though the thought was absurd to the Romans, the threat remained, also the diseases of the Parthians. In truth, the discipline and the occasional harshnesses the irritated Romans inflicted upon the Jews were due partly to the huge menace of the Parthians beyond the borders, who could not make up their minds whom they hated more, Romans or the Jews, and were equally enthusiastic about killing both. The Roman official and his physicians had duly examined Saul and had questioned his doctors, and had gravely examined the other members of the household, and had come to the correct conclusion that no plague existed, or any of the other diseases of the unspeakable Parthians. So the seal of quarantine was not affixed to the doors of Shabua ben Abraham's house, and the official and his physicians graciously accepted Shabua's invitation to dine with him that evening, and later his lavish gifts given in mighty relief that nothing threatened his house. Clodia Flavius assisted the nurses and ministered to Saul also, and told the father, "There is a fever in his soul, and that is worse than a fever of the body, but not fatal. He will recover, Hillel ben Baruch, though it is possible that he does not. Deep in the depths of his afflicted spirit, wished to do so." She regarded him kindly, and as she would a child. She was like tireless strength in that chamber, And she permitted Sephora to enter her brother's chamber, and Sephora wept over him, and put cool wet cloths on his burning cheeks and brow, and called to him in her soft, fluting voice. But beyond his sudden wild cries and threshings, his sudden struggles as if he were trying to escape from his flesh, he did not answer nor open his eyes. His face became smaller and grayer as the hours passed, and sunken. Aulus Platonius and his son, the captain of the Praetorians, visited the anxious father and consoled and cheered him, and so did Joseph of Arimathea, who stood for a long time in silence beside the bed, gazing down on the unconscious youth, and listening to his incoherent groans and exclamations. On the day before Sephora married Ezekiel, ben David, Saul regained consciousness. His fever had subsided, the sweat following it had been washed away, and he had been clothed in fresh white linen. He opened his eyes to see the face of his father bent over him, but one of the eyes did not fully open, though Hillel was not aware of that in his joy that his son had regained his senses. "It is well, my son," said Hillel with tenderness, and he kissed his son's cheek and rejoiced that once again it was cool. "You have been ill, but God, blessed be his name, has spared you to me. You will soon recover your strength." Saul whispered, and tears appeared on his eyelids. "I would that I had died." Rabban Gamaliel was in the chamber also, and he came to the bedside and said gravely, "It is God's will that you live, and you must not dispute him. You must rest and become strong, for he has wonders for you to accomplish." His face was suddenly exalted, and Hillel gazed at him mutely and with a far fear. "I fell into the darkness, and it was death," said Saul. Still in that faint whisper, it was as if he had not heard the Rabban. "I was not afraid, though it was only nothingness." He suddenly fell asleep, but his left eye remained partly open, and they could see the white of it, and the lower edge of the blue iris as it was upturned. It was not for some days that the physicians regretfully informed Hillel that the fever had partially paralyzed that eye, and while it was not blind, it would never be as the other again. And it was still later before that they knew that the fever had permanently affected a part of the brain, which would leave Saul a victim of occasional seizures. "The epilepsy is not serious," they told the grieving father. "It is possible that it was latent before his illness, and has only been somewhat intensified." "Is he a youth of passions and strong urges and vehement emotions?" "Yes," said Hillel sadly. He has had no seizures." He lifted his hands and said, "Why has God afflicted my child? Why did he not afflict me in his place? If he had stricken Job's children, then God and Job would not have triumphed over Satan. But what man can witness the suffering of his children and not turn from God?" Rabban Gamaliel said, "It is written that we must not question God, for his ways are not our ways, and we trust in him, that in his wisdom he has a reason for all." But Hillel could not be comforted. He sat for hours beside Saul's bed and looked upon him, and his heart was bleeding fragments. There were times when he knew that Saul was not sleeping and was aware of his presence, but Saul did not speak. And that is the end of chapter 13. Thank you. That will be all for today. Have a great one and be blessed.